Say what you want about Shedeur Sanders, but he does seem up for the challenge. Also, what if the other rookie quarterback is the real target for the Browns? We'll talk about it coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast.
You are Locked On Browns, your daily Cleveland Browns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Dog Pound? I'm Spencer German, your host of the Locked On Browns podcast, and proudly covering your Cleveland Browns each and every single day in the land and on the road. We've all had to do a 180 on Shedeur Sanders as far as the Browns are concerned. Also, Cam Ward speaks up. Could he be the real target for the Browns? And I found the one thing that Andrew Berry brought with him to Cleveland from Howie Roseman in Philly. We'll talk about all those things coming up on today's episode. But first, I do want to thank you for being an everydayer at the Locked On Browns podcast and for making us your first listen every single day. At the start of the offseason, at the start of this process with the Browns and their search for a quarterback, the conversation around Shedeur Sanders was very much so that the Browns were not going to be a fit, that Shedeur Sanders and his dad, Deion Sanders, would nix the Browns as a landing spot for his son, that they did not want anything to do with this franchise. And it all kind of stemmed from the idea that Deion talked about making sure his players, his guys, his sons, he considers Travis Hunter sort of family at this point as well, that they would end up in places that were advantageous to their careers, go in the right direction, and that would support them properly and all these different things. And that the belief was, like, after a 3-14 season, lots of turmoil, all this different stuff, that the Browns would not be on the list of teams that he would want his son playing for. That has completely changed over the course of several weeks for a multitude of reasons. I think, for starters, you did have Deion at the Super Bowl a couple weeks back, basically, making note that he's met with the top three teams and that he thinks his son is going to go to one of the top three teams, although I think he hadn't met with the Titans at the time. And that he feels like he's going to be the face of one of those franchises, and the acceptance of that. Like, it didn't seem like he was really against that, obviously. And on top of that, like, Shedeur has alluded to playing for the Browns and talked about meeting with them at the Shrine Bowl and how he's meeting with them as one of his first, or as his first pre-draft visit meeting will be early March, 2 weeks from now. And he will be meeting with the Browns before any other team for that process. So there seems to be this acceptance that the Browns are a place that he could play and that he'd be willing to go there. And from that, I think our thought process has had to change. We've gone away from the idea that Shedeur just would not play for the Browns. He'd rule him out. He wouldn't go there, to maybe this is really where the Browns are going. And maybe they actually want to draft him and they're most interested. And there's been so much smoke around this topic specifically and about the Browns link to Shedeur Sanders that it's starting to feel almost too good to be true. As we talked about, I think on an episode last week, like, the Browns generally move in silence. So this does seem sort of curious that all of a sudden they have such a blatant connection to a player, because this stuff doesn't usually come out for the Browns. Like, they're not usually really giving anything away this time of year, which is also kind of an interesting part of this conversation as well. But there's a new video that is making the rounds on social media where Shedeur Sanders is seen, starting a meal with some colleagues of his, some acquaintances of his, and you hear some people, talking in the background, and they basically throw out this idea that Shedeur is, when he plays Madden, he only plays with one team. And it's the Browns, and they're all doing their oohs and ahs of, oh, the Browns. Oh yeah. Okay. And he basically is this sort of throwaway line of, I like how they move on there. I like how they move. So he likes playing with the Browns. He likes the setup they have on their team on the video game. I'm obviously, as you connect the dots here and we piece this all together, this is one of those stories for me that feels like silly season, where we equate something because, we're looking for anything at this time of year. Football's over. We're going on to week 2 of no actual football games. And so, you'll take anything. You'll take anything that's football content, and try to link it to your favorite team, and try to say it means something. And so it could mean something. It could mean this. It could be the latest flirtation between Shedeur Sanders and the Browns. and sort of this acceptance of like, yeah, they could draft me, and I actually am pretty excited about it. It also could be nothing, like a lot of content that comes out this time of year, and we'll see. I don't necessarily need to dwell too much on that part of the conversation in relation to what it all means and if we should be reading into this or not. It could just be Shedeur having fun and leaning into all the rumors, because that's part of the game now this time of year too, is that you just kind of like go along with it. He's a smart guy. His dad is a content machine. He knows what's going to get clicks and get people interested and intrigued, especially this time of year. So it could just be that too. But more so for me, the thing that catches my attention with that video, with some other stuff that's come out about Shedeur, the fact that they haven't nixed the Browns as a place, and at least publicly. But again, the fact that they've met, and Andrew Berry had the comments at the Senior Bowl about like, I don't think it's going to be a problem for Shedeur to play in Cleveland if that's where we were to go. Tells me that like they all seem pretty comfortable with that arrangement if it were to happen. So I've backed off that completely. But again, unless something changes in the next couple months. But the bigger thing for me is like Shedeur talking so openly about it, and referencing his meeting with the Browns, and talking about playing with them, man. All this to me, though, at least seems like at the very least he is embracing this idea of the challenge that is being the franchise quarterback for the Cleveland Browns. That's kind of what it feels like for me. And I could be wrong here completely, but again, just like reading the tea leaves, hearing so much noise about it, hearing him talk about it, hearing him, talk about the meetings he has planned and all the different stuff that's on his radar as the Browns seem to at least be interested in him. It does feel like he's open to that idea and the challenge that is trying to be the quarterback for a franchise that has not been able to find a franchise quarterback to this point since they returned in 99. So again, it's silly season. So you got to sort of read in between the lines on these things and try to. Again, it's silly season. So you're sort of reading between the lines on these things and trying to interpret what it all means. But he has not shied away from the idea that like if he were to get drafted there, there's a stigma that comes with that. It's the Browns, it's Cleveland, it's the franchise that's never found a quarterback. It's where quarterbacks largely go to die. And I do think that is a trait or a quality that the Browns and Browns fans should want in their quarterback. They should want somebody. It feels, what it feels like, honestly? It feels very Baker Mayfield-esque, where Baker Mayfield was all about the idea of like, hey, if the Browns draft me, I'm going to be the franchise quarterback for them. Like, I'm going to turn it around. I'm going to be that guy. And Shedeur sort of at least is giving me those vibes right now, where it feels like he is open to being the guy for this team and being the guy that finally puts them over the top, if that's the way the chips are going to fall. That doesn't surprise me. I mean, think about who his dad is, right? Like family of athletes, Hall of Famer, and somebody who certainly isn't going to shy away from anything. So I'm at least intrigued by that part of this, because if Shedeur is embracing this idea of like, yeah, the Browns are going to take me at 2, and I think I can be this guy for them finally to put them over the top. That's huge. And I think that's where it honestly starts, is having a quarterback who has the confidence to do something like that and have that belief and come in and do it. So I continue to be enamored with the idea of Shedeur. I don't know if the Browns are going to pull the trigger or not. Again, I think the fact that there's been so much noise is a little bit curious. And that actually leads me into the next thing I want to talk about, because this could all be a smokescreen that's pointing to the other top quarterback as the guy that the Browns really want. Yes, I'm talking about Cam Ward, and we will talk about Cam Ward coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast. When the games tip off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off, or you want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same game parlay. With the NFL season behind us, you already know I'm watching a lot of Cavaliers basketball. And given the season they're having, they got a chance to do something special. Maybe you want to get in on a futures bet for them to win the finals. You might be a little bit late to the game on that one, but there's still a chance to cash out and win some money. And that can be true for you and others with the FanDuel app, which is easy to use. And when you win, by the way, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel. So as I mentioned, it just feels like there's too much noise around Shedeur Sanders at this point with the Browns. And part of my thought process on that is like the Browns tend to keep this stuff close to the vest. The last couple of years, they have not given anything away in terms of what they wanted to do in the draft, guys that they were interested in. You know, you heard they might have had guys in for visits, and that sometimes is a sign that they're looking at a guy. But they also, you know, there wasn't a lot of smoke or sound or rumors or noise around them having so much adamant interest in a certain player. And that's been the case for Shedeur. Like it's been all signs are pointing to Shedeur Sanders. And it just seems kind of eerie and weird to me because that's been different than what this organization has done in the past. So maybe it means something, maybe it doesn't. But that almost makes me wonder if the real target here for the Browns is Cam Ward. If that's the guy that they're actually after, and they're trying to sort of manipulate the draft to fall a certain way so that they can then draft Ward at number 2. I'll get to how that happens and what that kind of looks like and why this theory sort of works. But real quick, this thought started for me because I saw Cam Ward speaking out to the AP, through a story through the AP, where he basically, I'll just read you the quote verbatim. He said, "You're either going to draft me or you're not. If you don't draft me, that's your fault. You've got to remember you're the same team that has got to play against me the rest of my career, and I'll remember that." So, you know, doing the thing that sometimes players tend to do when they're rumored to be near the top of the draft or going to get taken to the top of the draft, where they're like, you know, don't draft me at your own risk because I'll make you pay for it. Now, this quote could end up being just like really sort of funny and comical if in the end the Titans just take him number 1, because then, you know, nobody even really had the chance to pass on him, where he's going to have to like do that revenge factor. I guess you could argue that they had a chance to trade up for him if they really wanted to. But, you know, in theory, if the Titans just take him, it's a non-starter, it's a non-problem, a non-question, a non-issue anyway. So we'll see. But the reason this got me thinking is because, as I alluded to, I've grown skeptical over some of the Shedeur Sanders buzz linking him to the Browns. And so what if Ward is the real target and they're trying to lure the way that I could see this playing out is like, if the Browns are putting all this out there and there's so much noise around Shedeur and they're interested in him, and it's complete opposite of what we've seen this organization do this time of year in the past. What they're maybe trying to do here is, if they know a team like the Giants love Shedeur, they're drafting 3rd. Maybe the Browns are like, listen, if you want Shedeur, you're going to have to trade up and get him because we want Shedeur. And they're making it so blatant that they are interested in Shedeur Sanders. This time of year in the NFL, this time of year is like a big game of poker. You are basically putting on your best poker face and putting stuff out there and you know, not giving anything away, trying to sort of lure people into folding or bending to your will in terms of what you want them to do, and then you get to win the hand. And I think that's what the Browns are trying to do here. They are trying to manipulate the situation to potentially make a team like the Giants think about, okay, we got to trade up because we really like Shedeur Sanders. So let's trade up, go get Shedeur, get to number 1, and then the Browns can't take him in front of us, and we get the guy that we really covet and want in the end. I think it's an interesting thought. Another team that could be involved here is the Raiders. That's another team that's been sort of linked to Shedeur Sanders, and there's the Tom Brady connection there, where I'm sure he wants to make a big splash, given, you know, he owns the team, what they've done with the coaching staff. They brought in Pete Carroll, trying to sort of put that organization back on the map and do a lot, you know, be sort of in the headlines this offseason. So there's a lot of stuff that kind of comes to mind there when it comes to those two teams being the ones that could be targeting Shedeur, could be targeting the quarterback. And because of that, I don't know. I'm just curious if they're trying to lure one of these teams to make that move off the board. And then that leaves them with Cam Ward as the player to take at number 2 overall. It could be nothing. It could be something. But I've started to think about this more and more because it just feels too good to be true that everything is coming up Cam Ward from the Browns organization. I also, this is what's going to be interesting. We got the combine next week. And to see how the narratives change or what becomes of the narratives these next couple weeks, especially during the combine, because to this point, Cam Ward hasn't been involved in the Shrine Bowl like Shedeur was, the Senior Bowl like some of these other guys were. He hasn't been involved in any of these offseason events just yet. He obviously hasn't had a pro day just yet. And so I'm curious to see like what happens when he's present at something like the combine and the Browns have a chance to actually meet with him, talk to him, interact with him. What sort of rumors and reports are coming out about their interest in him as a player over the course of these next couple weeks, specifically at the combine? Is it the same energy as Shedeur? Is it the same energy of, hey, we really like this guy, come get him. We like it. Is it that where then maybe they are just interested in both guys? Or is it more subdued where they're like, the Browns are sort of, or is the reports even of the opposite that they're like, well, the Browns aren't really sure about Cam Ward. And that's maybe with the reverse psychology thing in mind of like, we're going to make it seem like we're not interested in him when really we are. Because that's the thing. Like if it's more subdued, silence to me suggests that could be the player that the Browns actually want in the end. Because as I said before, Andrew Berry tends to move in silence. He doesn't like to give things away. Say what you want about this organization. One thing that has changed internally with the Browns over the last several years since Andrew Berry and Kevin Stefanski have been here is the fact that there's not a lot of leaks. There's not stuff like getting out about, their intentions on things or it's guys they want to sign or interest in certain players. It's just not there anymore. And so that's an interesting part of this because knowing that, it's now made me sort of question all the Shedeur Sanders hype and buzz and wonder if Cam Ward ends up being the guy that they really want. And for the record, I love Cam Ward. Of the two quarterbacks, I like him the best because he's got the most upside. He's got the unreal arm talent. He can improvise. He can do a lot of great things with his athleticism. I think he sees the field very well. But the biggest thing with him is like the recklessness. Like sometimes he tries to make a play, squeeze something in there, very in the ilk of Joe Flacco, like we saw here in Cleveland a couple years ago, where like he's going to force the ball sometimes and make some mistakes, sort of like Jameis Winston this past year, although maybe not to that extreme. And so I think that's the thing that's challenging with Cam Ward is like, can you coach that risk out of him? Can you make him more? Can you make him sort of more or less risk prone? And more sort of thoughtful in the way that he's doing things and deliberate in the way that he's doing things so that he's not giving you those mistakes that are going to cost you games in the long run. And there's only really been one other quarterback that we've seen like coach that out of himself, and that's Josh Allen. So maybe he can be that, but it's rare to see a guy like lose that when they get to the NFL level. So that's my big holdup with him. But I do like Cam Ward from a prospect standpoint more than Shedeur Sanders. And so it's interesting if maybe that's where they were to go or who they're interested in. We'll see what that looks like in the coming weeks. I'm as fascinated as I think as many of you to see how it all could kind of play out and come to fruition. But keep an eye on that because, again, we're still so early in the offseason, even though it seems like it's been going on for ages already. And there's still so much that has to happen and so much information to be learned and discovered about the Browns and where they could go at quarterback. We do need to talk about the one thing that Andrew Berry has brought with him from his time with Howie Roseman in Philly. We'll get to it coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast. All right, so as the Eagles won the Super Bowl a little over a week ago, and we obviously had a chance to reflect on that, and I asked the question, you brought Andrew Berry in because he came from the Eagles organization and the Browns, the Haslams, they tried to kind of be ahead of the curve on plucking from Howie Roseman's staff, like this innovative staff that has now produced 2 Super Bowl teams in the last 6 years, or I guess 7 years, but regardless. And listen, like there's been people now saying like, how are more people not plucking from Howie Roseman's staff to find their next GMs and top executives in the organization? And it's a fair point. But I've questioned as I have doubts about Andrew Berry drafting, using this year's like allotment of picks to pick players. I just don't know that he's this great a talent evaluator, the same way that Howie Roseman has proven he can be in Philly. So it's an interesting situation, but I did find the one thing that Andrew Berry has brought with him from Philadelphia. And it's not something that's good, though, unless you are doing things the way or team building the same way Howie Roseman is. There was an article put out after the Super Bowl last week that shows the 32 teams ranked by how much money they have tied up in void years. And so void years are basically like those dummy years that GMs put on the end of contracts so they can spread out signing bonus money and any like option bonus money into those years, but the years don't actually count in the contract. It's just like a bookkeeping measure or maneuver. But and once those void years hit, all that money accelerates onto your salary cap. That's part of the reason why the Myles Garrett situation is tougher than it seems to just trade. And there's so many people who are like, well, just trade Myles Garrett, give him what he wants, and get the picks. But it's not that easy because he has some money tied up in void years that if they trade him, all that money compounds into a $36 million, somewhere in that range, $35 to $40 million, a massive cap hit that goes on in the contract or under the salary cap this year, unless the Browns were to do it as a post-June 1st trade, and then you can split it between 2 years. But that's one of the biggest reasons why the Browns just can't up and trade Myles Garrett on a whim, because they have that to think about. And so anyway, back to this article, it basically lists the teams with the most money tied up in void years. And Philly is the number one team with money tied up in void years. $390.4 million they have in void years. San Francisco is 2. They have $204.1 million tied up in void years. So Cleveland is number 3 on the list at $187.5 million. And then the teams that follow Cleveland are all like bad teams. You got the Saints, the Jaguars, the Jets, the Dolphins, Dallas, Tampa Bay. And then you finally get to another good team, a playoff team from this past year. Detroit has $52 million tied up in in voided years, Baltimore has 50. Houston has just under 50. Minnesota has just under 50. And Denver has just over 40. And so you have some playoff teams sort of at the end of this. So that's all to say, like, this isn't something new. Like this is I guess it's a somewhat more recent phenomenon to do this. But it is commonplace that teams do this as kind of a cap saving measure. And the idea is like you push money down the line into years where the cap's going to be higher. And so that when you eventually pay that money, you have more money at your disposal to do it because it makes up less of a percentage of your total salary cap. So it is like sort of a savvy move that teams are doing nowadays, and that's all fine. But the Browns, the difference between the Browns and even the two teams in front of them, the 49ers and the Eagles who just won a Super Bowl, is that they haven't had a GM who's been able to build a solid roster to sort of like, you can do void years and make it work. The Eagles are proof of that. But the problem is, like, you got to be able to like be accumulating talent at the same time to sort of fill out the roster as guys age out and guys move on and you move on from certain players. And Andrew Berry hasn't done that. Now, some of that is because he hasn't had first round picks the last couple of years, but that's also on his watch. He's the one who made the Deshaun Watson trade. And the same thing can be said, obviously, about like his inability to hit on guys in later rounds. Like even Howie Roseman has hit on some guys. Josh Sweat, for example, 4th round pick for them. He's even hit on guys in like the 4th round occasionally, the 3rd round occasionally. He had Cooper DeJean is a 2nd round pick from this past year who became a starter for them and an important player for them and took an interception back for a touchdown in the Super Bowl nonetheless. So, and even the 49ers, like they've been to a couple of Super Bowls the last several years. Like they have a roster that's pretty well equipped to handle those void years because they keep filling it out behind them with talented players and they have a great coach. And again, I think Kevin Stefanski is a fine coach. I think it's less about that and more about the roster construction. But that's the thing. Like Andrew Berry, I guess, did bring this one thing with him from Philly. And so he learned something from Howie Roseman. But the problem is the talent evaluation and the roster building hasn't matched the ability to manipulate contracts as savvily as he does. And that's the thing. Like he can sit there and boast about, and he has said, we think that we have a staff that is capable of, doing like handling the salary caps as part of this really, really well. He believes that is a strength of this organization. And it probably is. I would give him the benefit of the doubt on the salary cap part of this. Like they find ways to finagle the cap. They'll find ways to finagle the cap this year to make some free agent signings and some acquisitions. So I'm not doubting that at all. But the problem is you might be great at that. You might be able to pay guys and you might be able to kick money down the road, but you haven't been good about building out the roster and filling out the roster through the draft. And that's the number one way to keep your team competitive and build a good team in the NFL is through the draft. That is the number one path to a great team. And he hasn't been able to do that. So, that's great that he brought at least one thing with him from the Eagles and he learned something from Howie Roseman. But the problem is what he's learned and what he's doing isn't really a good thing isn't really the best quality that you can have as a GM if the other part of it isn't matched up, if the roster building part of it isn't equaling what you're sort of doing with the cap manipulation. And so I guess on one hand, we can now point and say, okay, they are sort of like the Eagles, but there's a big, big void there in the way this roster has been assembled and built that he's lacking. And the Eagles obviously have that because they have a phenomenally stacked team that has a chance, I think, to go back and maybe defend their Super Bowl title because of how good they are. And yeah, we all thought Andrew Berry could be that guy because he was coming from the mind that is Howie Roseman, but that just has not been the case to this point. So that's going to do it for another episode in the books with you, Dog Pound. Thanks for joining me as always to talk about your favorite football team. There'll be plenty more to discuss in the weeks ahead, especially with the combine coming up and quarterback rumors and the whole 9 yards. I hope you'll continue to make us your first listen every day. For your second listen, go check out the Locked On NFL show. Or if you want to keep it local, you can check out Locked On Cavs or Locked On Guardians. Thanks for being an everyday here at the Locked On Podcast Network. I'll talk to you again real soon, Cleveland.